Olá, todo mundo. Hello, everyone. Meu nome é Maria Carolina, eu sou professora assistente da Neuma Business School na França. My name is Maria Carolina. You can all call me just Carol, and I'm assistant professor at Neuma Business School in France. E eu vou fazer a apresentação primeiro em português e depois em inglês. So first I will do the presentation in Portuguese and then in English. Então, bem-vindos. É a primeira vez que eu faço um webinar assim, então eu não consigo ver vocês, eu estou bastante acostumada a interagir com as pessoas no Zoom diretamente, mas vamos lá, estamos aqui hoje, né, para essa mesa redonda, com a professora Sônia Grier, o professor Kevin Thomas e o professor Guillaume Johnson. A Sônia Grier é professora na American University, o Kevin Thomas é da Marquette University e o Guillaume Johnson é da Paris-Dauphine. E assim, como que vai funcionar esse webinar? Eu tendo a falar um pouquinho rápido, então vocês estão liberados a dizer aqui no campo de questões que a moderadora está indo muito rápido, viu? Mas, assim, vocês vão colocar questões, tá, audiência? Vocês podem colocar em português e eu traduzo, ou podem colocar em inglês também. E aí a gente vai fazendo esse debate aberto aí com as questões de vocês, obviamente depois da apresentação dos participantes, né? Porque eles vão começar com um PowerPoint. Só pequeno disclaimer aqui, que a gente precisa ler uma autorizaçãozinha de direitos, antes de começar, então eu vou ler em português, depois eu leio em inglês. Então, para ir para todas as questões legais e jurídicas do Brasil, as manifestações expressas por integrantes dos quadros da Fundação Getúlio Vargas e por convidados que participam dos eventos e transmissões online representam exclusivamente as opiniões de seus atores e não, necessariamente, a posição institucional da FGV. Reiteramos também que todos aqui presentes concordaram em participar desse evento de forma espontânea e, com isso, autorizam o uso de sua imagem para essa transmissão que ficará disponível posteriormente nos canais oficiais da FGV. Now, in English, so hi everyone, and thanks for being here. I'm going to present our three guests. So we have here with us today Professor Sônia Grier from the American University, Professor Kevin Thomas from Marquette University, and Guillaume Johnson from Paris-Dauphine. And they are going to start with the presentation, and then there are open questions here. So I am... Okay, so I have someone asking why doing the presentation in Portuguese if everything is going to be in English. I'm doing Portuguese because maybe not everyone is completely fluent, so we want to increase accessibility for most people as possible. And so the professors are going to start with the presentation, and then I'm going to open for questions. Again, questions can be done either in English or in Portuguese, and I'll be trying to mediate everything. So just before I give the stage to our guests, I just need to read a little disclaimer here for legal reasons. So basically, hello, Brazilian courts, we can say to you that all statements expressed by Fundação Getúlio Vargas employees and guests in our online events and broadcasts exclusively represent their opinions and not necessarily FGV's institutional position. We also reiterate that everyone present here agreed to participate in this event of their own free will, and they consented to be recorded in this broadcast, which will be posted later on FGV's official channels. Well, so enough of me, because we have a very interesting talk to be done by Professors Grier, Thomas, and Johnson. So it's up to you. Tell me here if you have any difficulty in sharing screens or whatever. Thank you. Oh, just a quick question. Just a final thing. Thanks, Letitia and Lilian, for all the technical support that you are giving us. And in the end, please stay online because we are going to have the next event with Marlon, which will be a very good open discussion on theorizing. Thank you. And there you go.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Carol. I'm going to go ahead and start my screen share now. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that okay. So yeah, thank you again, Carol, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to the organizing committee for the invite for us to share our work today. I can only imagine the amount of work that went into putting this all together during the height of a pandemic. So we are all definitely grateful for all the effort that you've put into this to bring this to fruition today. So yeah, I'm Kevin Thomas, one of the co-organizers of Race in the Marketplace Research Network, along with Sonia Greer and Guillaume Johnson. We'll be talking today about theorizing in race, and what we'll be doing is using our organization, RIM, as a case study to really talk about how we have, over this last, I guess, maybe 5-6 years since RIM's been in existence, tried to develop a legitimate way of understanding, distributing, and hopefully transforming how race is done in the marketplace. So just to give you a sense of what this will look like over the next hour or so, we'll start with just really giving you a sense of who we are as scholars and as human beings. I know a lot of times during these types of events, we focus really on the scholarly aspects of it, and we don't really connect with our humanity. So we wanted to also spend some time giving you a sense of who we are as people. And then we'll go into what is RIM, a little history on what it is and how it came to be, and the kind of tenets that we adhere to. And before jumping into this really the meat of the matter, the theorizing around race, we thought it would be helpful also to talk briefly about why race matters, right, before we actually get there. And even though over this past year, with all the racial uprisings and reckonings that we've seen across the globe, that question isn't as needed, I would say, as it might have been a year or so ago. I do think it's still important for us to start there, so we all are understanding just the depth of what race means when we think about it in the context of marketing and consumer behavior. And again, we'll wrap up with some, again, using RIM as a case study, how we've come to theorize around race, both scholastically, kind of traditional academic papers and other academic work, and also through engaged scholarship or activist scholarship that we've all been taking part in. And so we hope to have maybe about an hour or so of time where we're sharing, and then we want to have plenty of time for Q&A. So we hope to wrap this up in about an hour. So to begin, I will start with myself. So again, just to kind of reiterate what Carol was saying about me, I'm at Marquette University. My official title is Assistant Professor of Multicultural Branding there. I'm in the Comm School. I've been there for a couple of years now. Before moving to Marquette, I was at UT Austin for several years in their advertising department. And we thought when we talked about ourselves, we really want to express two specific aspects of ourselves. What brought us to this work around race and markets, and how do we sustain our well-being as we do this work? Because as anyone who's tried to do any work around this area, it can be grueling, not just the mental aspect of it, but the physical, the psychic aspect of it on ourselves, and our well-being can be tough. And so we also want to talk a little bit about how we sustain ourselves in this work. And for me, what I would point to is just being an African-American male who grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood. I saw firsthand how people thought that they knew me before they knew me. Right? My identity was always already known because of the images that they saw on TV, the way that we were portrayed in commercials and print ads certainly made a lasting impression on folks, and they thought that they kind of knew me before they knew me. I was typically considered a threat. I was bigger than most other kids, certainly darker than most other kids. And so that sense of not really getting a sense to see my humanity, it troubled me. And I always wondered, even as a young child, how did this come to be? And so I looked at the TV quite often to see how I rarely saw myself being presented, whether it be on just typical media, but specifically with the marketing communication, because there was so much of it, and not seeing myself, or when I did see another Black person, certainly not someone that I typically could connect with as someone who was, you know, identifies as queer, coming from a working class background. You know, there was these nuances to my identity that were never shown on these representations. And so that stuck with me for a very long time. And as I entered the workforce, I began to work within market communications and marketing research, specifically in the food industry. And there I started to see how, quote unquote, good people could really put into practice some really racist policies around, you know, where do we put stores? What stores could get fresh produce versus the stores that don't get the freshest produce? Which stores actually are blockaded with security versus ones that are not? Which stores actually put merchandise behind cages, which stores don't? And all that seemed to be very much dictated by race. And so I thought to myself, there's something very deeply disturbing here when there's, you know, for the most part, very good people that I enjoyed working with, people that I enjoyed hanging out with even outside of work, didn't see a problem with these racist policies and didn't see them as racist, just thought that this was just good marketing logic. And after hitting my head against the wall for, you know, I was in the industry for about 10 years, I decided to go back, get a PhD and see if I could potentially make a change on the other side, hopefully getting people before they get into the industry to start thinking more critically about these policies, these systems, and how we might be able to get the marketplace to be much more equitable around race. And so that's what's really brought me to this, to doing this work. And so most of my work revolves around trying to understand the intersection between marketing, consumption, and identity, and how those three things interact with each other, and how can we actually have a marketplace where all ourselves are brought to the fore in that marketplace, so we can be our full selves and see our full selves represented, and hopefully have systems behind those representations that are also more equitable, where folks can thrive, regardless of whether they're in a working class neighborhood or an affluent neighborhood. So I'll stop there and I'll turn it over to Sonia so she can tell you a little bit about herself.
Hello, everyone. And again, thank you for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here online with you all. My work has focused on race for quite some time, and listening to Kevin, it made me try to kind of really go back and think about when it started. And I would say a pivotal moment for me was actually in high school. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, which, you know, at the time I grew up, it was like 300% Black. It was, you know, one of the, you know, poster childs for Black cities in the USA. And so the challenges that Kevin mentioned with identity weren't as relevant to me till I went away to college at Northwestern University. However, in high school, I remember reading in a history class, there was like 1 to 2 sentences about apartheid and people having to carry a passbook. And I just like, what is this? And I went to my history teacher and he was like, yeah, kind of like, so what? Very ambivalent and blasé about it. So I went to my English teacher and he said, yeah, and he explained to me what it was and told me all about it. And he said, I think you should do your senior thesis on that. So I did my senior thesis on apartheid, which really sort of put me into understanding race and hierarchy in high school. And when I went away to college, I was very active in the anti-apartheid movement and became really concerned around different issues around race, because I think that example really made me sensitive and made race very salient to me. And one of the things I worked at Kraft in food marketing, similar to Kevin, working with food and research. And then I went back to do an MBA. And when I went to get an MBA, one of the things that stood out to me is that there were no professors who looked like me. And so I did focus groups. I did an independent study with Bobby Calder to figure out why we had no Black professors, and developed a marketing plan for Kellogg. And after that, we had the most Black doctoral students of any big university after a while. And that really made me want to go into the PhD program, seeing how change could be made from a different level from what I had been doing at Kraft. So my dissertation actually focused on race from a behavioral decision theory perspective. It was experimental work about how people make decisions about people based on race. And then that work really laid the foundation for my work, which has primarily been on targeted marketing. And I started looking at it from an individual perspective and moved to evolve to think about it at a group level, a community level, and a societal level, including the types of interventions that you might use. And now my work really focuses on racial dynamics in the marketplace across different domains and across different sectors. I would say I sustain myself in this work by really seeing the changes that are made, even the incremental ones. As I look at what has happened in the last year, I've never heard marketing literature or classrooms and professors talk about systemic racism and structural racism and these issues. So I see that as some incremental change, and that keeps me going and wanting to be a part of that. So now I'll turn it over to Guillaume.
Could I just interject? I forgot to actually include my wellness, how I sustain my well-being. And so I'll just quickly add in that for me, I have a daily meditation practice that I follow. I actually include that in my classroom so that I have students that will meditate either before or after class, or sometimes even in the middle of class. If things are getting heated, we'll stop and do a meditation. And so I try to interweave all aspects of my life, so I'm not trying to tear myself asunder. And then also I have a photography practice that I do when I'm not finishing up a journal article or putting together curriculum for the next day. So those two things really do sustain me. Thank you for interjecting. Please go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like also to thank you for the invitation. So for me, it's a bit different. It's quite difficult to say to be reflective on where I'm coming from and who I am, because I'm French, and in French we're not supposed to talk about race. So it is some work to talk about that, to talk about myself as a French person, as a Black French person. I guess I also have the same experience as Kevin in the marketplace, even though in French we're not supposed to have those issues. And I was looking for my own way. I thought for a long time that my father is from West Africa, from Togo. So I always thought that I would be going back there, this idea of going back to Africa, even though I've never came from there, but this idea of identity that you create Africa as a place of birth, even though you never been really there. And one day I discovered at university that there's a work which is called researcher, and researcher gives you freedom. And this is the reason why I chose that word, because it gives you freedom. And at that time I had to take a research project. So I just thought that I would compare Black and white people on advertisement and see what works. So I was, 21, and I came up with this methodology, and obviously what had been done before in the US, but never been done in France. And I really like it. It was good fun. Yes, for me, is where I got into the topic, just comparing ads with Black and white people and see how it works. And yeah, I like it, people like it. But then I wanted to do a PhD based on that and make it a bit more difficult. And no, that was the end. They didn't like the idea of going further with that, because they said, this is not the topic that we have to deal with in France. So I had to find my own way. And I went to South Africa. I was 23. I didn't really speak English at that time. And I just went to South Africa because I thought I needed to learn English. And I was very curious. It was this idea of going to Africa, discover my own route. But again, this was not really my route. But I went to South Africa, and the way I was received, the way I did my work was totally different. I had some freedom. So I did work on race and advertisement, and then I moved to some other topic on race and different services. So I was supposed to go to South Africa for 1 year, and finally I stayed there for 6 years. And after 6 years in South Africa, I decided to travel. So I went to China. I worked in China for 1 year. And then it was time to try and come back to France. So I came back to France. I'm based at the University Paris-Dauphine, but my work, in fact, is at the CNRS. CNRS is the French National Research Center. So my work, in fact, is research, 100% research. This is time of work. For me, it's the dream work. I can do whatever I want. and I can do this research that people in France still don't want me to do. From the government, probably you saw that in the news, the government is not happy about this type of research, but my institution is giving me that freedom, and I'm striving to do it a good way. And how do I take care of myself? I've got a happy family, and they take care of me. 2 daughters, 2 beautiful daughters, and they take care of me. And nice partner too. Yeah.
All right, so hopefully you have a better sense of who we are as people and why we're doing this work. So next, I think Sonia's gonna dig into what is RIM.
Your mic, Sonia.
Sorry about that. You can see on the screen the our key pillars and our board members, and I'm going to give you a sense of how we started RIM and just an overview of what it is that we do and what our vision was. So one day, the 3 of us, Kevin, Guillaume, and I, were chatting about our individual experiences at different marketing conferences. And sort of the key focus was the fact that there was nothing about race, you know, sort of like I had just come from a conference, each of them had just come from a conference. And it's like, how many sessions dealt with what you're interested in? None, 1. There was typically than 1 session that really dealt explicitly with race. And so we thought that was, you know, a challenge for us. We also discussed the lack of a critical perspective, which really foregrounded what we saw as the reality of what was going on in the marketplace, that power, privilege, and oppression were playing out across domains in markets, but that wasn't what the research was really reflecting. But we did know that there were spaces outside of marketing where people really focused on race and did this kind of work. Because I was, for example, in public health, I left my job. I was at Stanford in my first job, and I left and went to the University of Pennsylvania for a program called Health and Society Scholars. And I worked in public health, applying marketing knowledge to issues in public health. So that was one area. Sociology, we had met colleagues there. And there were other places, economics, psychology, public policy, where they made race a focal construct. And we didn't do that. And we saw that there were still all these practical challenges that were happening in the marketplace over and over and over. And I think we still see a lot of those. But we saw that there wasn't really anyone who was coordinating what was going on or really trying to create this kind of space. So we decided to try to create such a space where researchers who were focused on these kind of topics could come together and build something new and build this transdisciplinary field that integrates learnings from across diverse markets. So we identified people who were doing this kinds of work and who might be committed and want to work with us on it. And you can see our advisory board that we have of 12 people and who work with us to help us develop activities. They suggest activities. We run very kind of informally. But our vision really, in summary, was built on this notion of the need for a critical approach, which foregrounds the reality of power, privilege, and oppression, the desire to theorize across diverse contexts, like not only in what we think of as commercial markets per se, because health and other markets have the same types of exchange bases and have significant impact on our lives, and to really take an interdisciplinary approach as well as a global approach and think about race across different countries and cultures and contexts. Kevin, you can go to the next one.
All right, and so to begin with, what we did in 2017 was to have our first symposium, kind of research network symposium, where rather than have a traditional, you present papers and your poster sessions, this was really focused around how do we build a research network, right? What does that look like when to build a research network that focuses on issues of race in the marketplace? And so we had about 50 scholars that applied. There was a call for applications sent out that specifically asked about, would you want to be a part of some type of research that did this type of work? What would that type of research look like for you? What type of services would you need in a research network that does this type of thing, right? And so we had about 50 people show up to this symposium that took place at American University in DC. And again, the idea was to build trust, to build an understanding of relationships across disciplines, which is not easy when we're typically speaking different languages, around what research looks like. And when it's international, literally speaking different languages when people are coming from outside the US. And so the 2.5 days or so that we were there was really just about developing a sense of unity around what the vision was going to be for this research network. And so I'm just going to show this, I think it's about 6 minutes or so, video that kind of gives you a sense of what took place during that initial research symposium.
Our idea was really to create a space where people could talk about these issues, but not just within marketing, but across disciplines, so that we, took the best of all the disciplines in the way that they approach race and develop something new.
What we want people to do is to feel elevated.
Sometimes African Americans go from being from a position of market exclusion to market exploitation. And so the study we did in Harlem showed that just exposure, each additional exposure you have to an alcohol ad outside in your neighborhood actually increases your odds of drinking that's indicative of user dependence.
We want you to bring your whole selves to this, that this isn't just about an academic conference. Come as you are. Come with what's going to make you feel comfortable and make you feel good about participating.
My grounding assumption about the marketplace is that it's a stage on which social interactions take place. Someone, I think it was Nicholas who said, it's just as much a social construct as race is. It's just as much a social construct as class is.
People might experience power and exclusion and inequality, and it might not align to how we might typically think about it, because there are these intersections with race, class, and gender.
So my question that I'm going to ask you right now is to think about what was one thing that you've done in the last 48 hours that connected you to the joy that is already within you.
So you can see really that the focus was to be extremely dialogical, right? This idea of how do we actually start to theorize around these constructs, race, marketplace, the intersectionality of other identity aspects that are also important here. And so those 2.5 days were really about having a space to talk through and come to some type of consensus around how are we understanding these constructs, race and marketplace and the interactions of the two. And also just to have fun together, right? Hopefully that came through in the video as well, that this wasn't simply about, putting our heads down and working the whole time, but really having a sense of getting to know each other as people and getting to build relationships that are sustainable beyond simply the work in front of us, right? And so that we can hopefully have a sense of each other's humanity. So that was the first one. I'll give Guillaume an opportunity to talk about the second one.
You want to start it?
Yeah.
Okay, so the second conference was in Paris. The first one was in Washington, DC. The second conference moved across the Atlantic and moved to Paris. What came up from the first conference, there was a lot of debate about boundaries. Boundaries was the emerging theme, the central issue we were facing when we were discussing during the first conference. It was boundaries in terms of markets domain, in terms of disciplines, because we're all from different disciplines, in terms of geographies, and also in terms of concepts. Okay, so for instance, an important question that emerged from the first conference was, what is a marketplace? So during the first conference, before the first conference, we were very careful in defining precisely what is race. So we had a precise definition, because that was the starting point for the network. But we had left the definition of marketplace quite open, because we were aware that we were all three from marketing, from advertising, and we don't want to come with a marketing definition of marketplace. So, but then we had a very rich discussion on what is a marketplace. So for the second forum, that was the idea to focus on those boundaries and see how we can try to cross them if we cannot try to break them, okay? So the idea of that second forum was to continue that dialogue and to try to understand in a different way race and market. So this second conference was a bit more traditional. We had papers, people submitted papers, but there was still this idea of dialogue was very important for us. So before the conference started, we had a workshop that we call Photo Dialogue that looked at how we can use photography to do race in the marketplace research. So we'll talk about it a little bit later. And the conference, we had about 100 researchers that submitted papers, and we had special session on branding, social justice, on Black capitalism, on colorism, on religion, gentrification. So we had like different topics. And we also had like different activities, like arts, luncheon. We had meet the editors, because we had 2 special issues linked to the conference. But now we can look at the video that will explain. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the 2019 RIM Forum. Cross-national, cross-disciplinary, and cross-conceptual debate.
So I decided from my story to understand how hate could express itself online.
When there's so much going on around race and markets around the world, to be able to bring people together across countries and cultures and disciplines.
Marketplace is defined broadly enough as any place of exchange. So we can think about exchanges of ideas. We can think about exchanges of cultural goods that may not necessarily involve buying and selling.
We had a section, one of my doctoral seminars, on race, and I read the material, and it just triggered my interest in wanting to kind of look at this from a more critical way.
Rising violent Islamophobia, xenophobia, how difficult it is to migrate to America and set up a business there.
How race is operating in the marketplace, and kind of shifting it from this understanding of kind of individualized into reframing it as the system itself as being to be transformed.
These commodities that I mentioned could be called racial prostheses. They refer to commodities presented as a discursive construction.
For that, stay tuned.
All right, and we also just wanted to share just kind of a timeline. Again, RIM hasn't been around for too long. Again, that first conference was in 2017, but we did want to share what we have been doing since that first initial conference. So I think, was it?
Sonia, I can start. So in 2017, we had the conference that you've already heard a little bit about. We also wrote an article about ICON for the ICON series in CMC, as well as an article about privilege. And I won't go into detail because we're going to talk about both of them in some detail in terms of their content around race. We also did a film for the ACR Film Festival in 2018 that talked about crossing race and boundaries. And this was a way of beginning to bring some of these things together and aggregate them and put forth a vision about how RIM would begin to theorize around race. So these first papers really provide some of that theoretical foundation, and then the film that we presented at the ACR Film Festival starts to present this so that we're aggregating it and putting it together as we go along. Guillaume, you want to talk about 2019 and 2020? Is that Kevin?
Sorry, who is?
Yeah, I think it's you, Guillaume.
Of the 2019.
Or I can, yeah, I can do it. So 2019, we did that, and we talked a little bit about this, and you saw it in the film a little bit, the photo dialogue workshop. And to Sonia's point, you're starting to see here that this intentional branching out between traditional ways of theorizing and distributing academic knowledge to these kind of non-traditional ways. So a film, a photography workshop. We definitely wanted to expand out and not just focus in on traditional ways of disseminating this work. And so we did the photo dialogue prior to the second conference. The CMC icon, Race as an Icon paper came out in 2019. And then there was also a special edition of a journal called Dysfunction, again, more of a non-traditional distribution channel for this type of work that focused on white rain, which one of our advisory members, Kwame, headed up. And so that's also another way that we are distributing this work. And then also lastly, the RIM book that we developed, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. That was an edited book where we brought in scholars from across the globe to talk about issues of race and markets, was published and sent out in 2019. Moving to 2020, even though it was certainly a interesting year with the pandemic, we were certainly still able to be pretty productive on the RIM front. We have a paper from JPPM that talks about the operationalizing of critical race theory for marketing scholars and consumer behavior scholars. So we'll talk a lot more about that in a little bit when we get into the theorizing aspect of it. We have a special issue of the Journal of Marketing Management, a UK-based journal, again, very consciously wanting to make sure that we're not just focused on the US, but internationally as well. So there was a special issue there. And then lastly, there was a article that also came out of that second conference in the journal called EDI that looked at the photo dialogue workshop that we did that focuses on photography as a way of anti-racist pedagogy. And again, we'll talk more about that when we get into the theorizing section.
Okay, for 2021. So this may be written in 2021, but everything is going to happen like in the coming days. It's been like years of work, but everything is coming soon. So maybe we can start directly with the CCB workshop. It's happening now. So just want to thank everyone for being here. Now, in the next weeks or next days, I was on the website today and it must be coming out soon. There is a special issue in the JCA, the Journal of Consumer Affairs. So it's a special issue edited by Frederick Raywith from Princeton Washington University, is a sociologist, and Vanessa Perry, a marketing professor from the George Washington University. So there's like many papers. I'm just going to give you the title of one paper. It's called Dreaming in Black, Middle Class Blacks Aspirational Consumption. Another paper is Racial Differences in Holding a Retirement Saving Motive. So we've got like few other papers. Then in, I don't know, next week or so, because we got the proof last week, I think, there will be the ISRF bulletin. So the ISRF is the Independent Social Research Foundation. This is the foundation that sponsored the photo dialogue workshop in Paris. So they asked us to edit a special issue of the bulletin. So it's less academic, it's more like general audience, big public, and is short pieces of 1,000 words. And got different pieces from different RIM scholars. So just a few titles is like Asking Immigrants for Money, Marketing, Remittances, Service Around the World, and got a Visual Incarceration and the Other Prisoner. So we've got different, the focus on that special issue is very much on visuality, on visual culture and race. And happening next month, so on Wednesday, the 23rd of June, so please save the date, Wednesday, 23rd of June, is the Jerry Symposium. So Jerry, this is a symposium in the honor of the legacy of Jerry Henderson. Jerry Henderson passed away in 2019. She was a friend of us, a colleague, a mentor, and she was one of the funding advisory board member of RIM. She was very important to RIM as a scholar, but also as a person. So now we have this symposium to honor a legacy, and during that symposium, there will be the two winners of the Jerry Junior Scholar Award that will present their work. I don't know if the name of the winner are public yet. No, they're not public yet. Shall I give them the name, or is private?
I think it's okay.
Okay, so the winner are, you can say, I was trying to say that. So the winner are Noémie Michel from the University of Geneva, and she will present a work on blackface in Europe. She's in political science. And John Robinson, who is in sociology and is from Washington University in St. Louis, and his work focused on the housing market in the US. So there you can see is that it was not on purpose, but is what the winners are. They are international, cross-disciplinary, and they are critical scholars. So again, the date is the 23rd of June, and this would be a good and important occasion to discuss the theorization of race with those scholars. So I invite you to come. But now we're going to start to discuss the theorization of race through a work.
Yeah, so I think before we jump deep into the theory, we wanted to take a step back and really talk about why race matters. And the ICON paper that we published back in 2019 really does kind of focus on that. It kind of introduces this idea of race as this hidden icon. But I'll let Sonia kind of talk a little bit more about the paper and kind of the key takeaways and why we see race as an important matter in our field.
So we wrote this for the piece, and we started with the whole notion of icon, but because it was for that section in icon. And as we looked at all the various definitions, a big part of it was something that was really salient and visible, but at the same time almost ignored. And this really reflected the way that we saw how race was treated in the marketing literature. So the idea of race really includes this socially constructed beliefs that individuals can be hierarchically divided into discrete and exclusive groups based on these perceived physical and cultural traits. However, these systems of differentiation also bestow privilege and oppression and really highlight the notion of power. And these are the issues that we haven't seen as much in the marketing literature. So while both research and practice show that race has this hierarchical effect on people's experiences in the marketplace, we don't see this in the literature. I mean, we saw this history firsthand when we visited the Smithsonian African American.
Sonia, I think you're muted.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Was it unmuted at any point?
Yes, it just the last 5-10 seconds.
Oh, that's really weird. It did it on its own, so maybe my energy did it. So I think maybe you lost me at the point where I was saying that research and practice showed that this hierarchy that is there in the market really sets a foundation for people's experiences and outcomes. And we saw this at the museum. And we also see that these same kind of dynamics really remain central to what we do. So when you look at things like redlining and target marketing and targeted advertising, they still build on these distinctions in ways that don't always contribute to consumer well-being. So as we looked at what was out there in the literature, we saw that the work just wasn't there in marketing. The work related to race and racism was really, was largely marginalized and all but absent from the top journals. There was a review of literature on marketing and racism by Judy Davis, and she identified only 75 scholarly articles between 1969 and 2017. Then there was another review by Cassie Pittman, who you saw in the video, and she identified 27 articles focused on Black consumers in the top marketing journals since their inception. 27 articles. So this really shows how relative to other topics that may not have as much of a bearing and impact on consumers' well-being really isn't discussed, particularly in terms of hierarchy, social justice, power, and privilege. Rather, we tend to use race in marketing as this segmentation variable that helps us to direct marketing activities towards particular groups or to compare, the disparities between certain groups without really making race a focal construct. So those were really the key takeaways around that in terms of the lack of race, the need to insert power and privilege and think about that hierarchy and how it has an effect on consumers' experiences and outcomes.
So now we'll discuss one paper that we also published in CMC, and that's focused on halal. What I have to say first is that the starting point of this research was not about race. We didn't start this research with race in mind, but we got to it through the data. And I will explain how later. So the starting point of this research was more controversy surrounding the introduction of halal meat in a fast food chain in France. We were interested on the discourse on laïcité, secularism in France, and how this discourse is used in a marketplace context. So to present very quickly what secularism is or laïcité is in the French context, but it's not only in France, obviously. It's just the idea that the state and the church must be separated. Okay, so in other words, that the state should not be involved with the business of the church, and vice versa, that the church should not be involved with the business of the state. But so there's been like a lot of controversy in France in the many years now, I cannot say like the 10 last years, but 20 last years. And the meaning has slowly shifted. And now through several laws, through several controversies, now there's the belief that it's not only the state that needs to be neutral from the church, from religion. What needs to be neutral is the public space. So it's a public space, including the market. So I guess this was the starting point, was to question that neutrality of the market and to critically discuss how the market can be neutral. And this is related to discussion they are already in the US regarding meritocracy, this idea that the market is neutral, this notion of colorblindness. The market is not influenced by race. Okay, and for us, the question is like how some people may benefit from the discourse on neutrality. Okay, and we frame that benefit in terms of privilege. Okay, so we took a Foucauldian approach to analyze laïcité as a discourse of power. And the discourse of power was to see how laicite would be used to legitimate or delegitimate the new marketing strategy. Okay, and what was Foucault important is because Foucault, in the conceptualization of Foucault, he dissociates power from privilege. So today there's a lot of talk about privilege. There's all this notion of like check your privilege and all of these different things. I won't really get into that. But what Foucault said is like it's important to differentiate both between what privilege is what is possessed versus power is what is exercised, okay? And that we need to understand power dynamics if we really want to understand privilege, not only focus on privilege, okay? So in the paper, we look at how change in the marketplace will highlight those power dynamics. And we analyze this through discourse, okay? And more specifically, we look at how privilege is challenged or is defended in the marketplace, okay? And how this is done through discourse. So we look at three types of discourses: the discourse on freedom, this idea that the fast food chain is free to do anything they want. It's a private company. This discussion of equality. Some people were considering that this marketing strategy was a discrimination against non-Muslim. It was discrimination against white. So this is like when the discussion of race starting to come. They said it was race reverse discrimination, anti-white racism. And there was also this notion of fraternity. And this was questioning the legitimacy of Muslim consumer within the French marketplace, okay? So in this discourse, race initially was not there, but then we slowly in the narrative on laicity, we saw how the discourse laicity was used, instrumentalized by some to create categories, to get categories between some civilized, secular, and some uncivilized groups, okay? So then, and those groups were not only created, but they were also essentialized. Okay? So they had this idea that those consumers could not escape those categories. Okay? And those, in that research, so we show, this is how the argument, we show how race, how religion is racialized, how religion is essentialized in the marketplace, that some are seeing it as neutral, and how religion, but also ethnicity, can be used as proxies for race in some discursive techniques.
All right, and then I'll talk a little briefly about the Race in the Marketplace book, which really builds on that finding from the Halal paper, that idea of really wanting to question the marketplace as a neutral site, right? And so we began the book really with the idea of really building in those tenets of RIM, that it needed to be critical, it needed to be interdisciplinary, and it needed to be international. But at the heart of it, it needed to really unearth this idea and disturb this idea, trouble this idea that the marketplace is a neutral site, is a site where if we just pull out the racism, everything will be fine, right? For what we talk about in the introduction to the book is how there is no pulling out racism from the marketplace. They are interwoven to such a degree that they are co-constituted, right? That there is no market without racism, and we wouldn't understand racism without the market, right? So we posit that this understanding of race, to theorize race, is to see these two things as conjoined, and to have a very long history of that. And so we build on some of Cedric Robinson's work in Black Marxism as a way of constructing an argument around this idea of the race as the marketplace as a site of racism inherently, right? That it's kind of baked in, it's cooked into it. And so the book itself is constructed into 4 specific parts. There's the space and time, racialization, intersectionality, voices and modes of understanding, and then neoliberalism, markets and marketization. And what we're trying to do here is really talk about how, again, this is space and time. Race isn't confined to one modality, one domain, and that it needs to be historicized to really be understood, right? So we think about having to understand race across space and time, right? And the racialization and intersectionality, race isn't just about a phenotype, right? Even though we spend a lot of time talking about people's skin color and different types of phenotypic characteristics as a way of reading race, that's not the only way we read race, right? Just again, the Halal paper, we talked about religion as serving as a proxy for race, but certainly ethnicity, other cultural practices can also serve as that proxy for race. And so we talk about that a lot in the book. And then this idea of intersectionality, that race isn't just some individual characteristic that doesn't have any impact or isn't being impacted by other aspects of identity. So how is race and gender and sexuality and social class intersecting to create these unique experiences within the marketplace is something we're also interested in. Voices and modes of understanding, again, that idea of it takes more than just one way of looking at race to understand it. We've got to use a multitude of methodologies and theoretical frameworks to really understand this, which requires a transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary approach. All right, and then lastly, to go back to Sonia's point, race isn't just a variable that we can use, but it's a social political construct, and it needs to be understood in relationship to neoliberalism, markets more generally, and that process of marketization. Right? And then lastly, really wanted to decenter the US experience as the only experience of race. And so we asked, when we sent out the call for chapters for the book, that we really wanted this to be an international focus and to bring out some of these nuances that we see across regional contexts when we think about how race is experienced in the marketplace. Anything to add, Guillaume, Sonia, on the book? Okay. So then lastly, I think this is kind of one of the last papers we'll talk about, is our more recent work that's in a special issue of Journal of Public Policy and Marketing, Operationalization of Critical Race Theory in the Marketplace. And I would say this is kind of the culminating piece. And so if you are really interested in trying to have like a template or looking for a way to really kind of walk through the steps of how you might be able to integrate and theorize around race as it relates to marketplaces, this might be a great paper to reference. What we're really doing here is, and this paper comes out of a session from the TCR track, the Transformational Consumer Research Organization. So it's a fairly large group of scholars, again, multidisciplinary. We also had a practitioner on our team to also give us that sense of on the ground grassroots perspective of how we might be able to integrate critical race theory into our understanding of markets. And so we spent time at that conference thinking about the paper, and then several more months writing and rewriting. And basically what we decided to do is really hopefully push the field from thinking about simply critical theory to how can we think about critical race theory. So the elements of critical theory have been in marketing scholarship for several decades now, right? This idea of thinking more critically about power dynamics within the marketization process. And so that's been extremely useful for us to try to think about as scholars, what are the socio-cultural, socio-political implications, broadly speaking, of marketing dynamics. But what's still been under theorized is what is that specific impact of race. We still see that not really coming to the fore and really being centered as a key aspect of what we're seeing in the race and seeing happening in the marketplace. And so our argument is that we need to move from that critical orientation, that CT orientation, to a CRT orientation, to critical race theory, which is, again, has been around for a very long time, has been used in other fields, education, critical organization studies, but it emerged from the legal field, mainly from legal scholars of color in the early 80s. And so it's been around for a very long amount of time as far as paperwork or scholarly work has been, that's out there. But we haven't seen anyone really focus on this in our field. And so we took on this task of how can we actually use this approach, which seems to be very helpful for trying to understand those power dynamics specifically as it relates to race in the marketplace. How can we actually provide a kind of a way for folks to, one, understand what critical race theory is, but also integrate it into their marketplace or consumer behavior research. And so we really focus on the key tenets of critical race theory as a way of theorizing around how race is operating in the marketplace. And so these tenets kind of just, serve as that template for, well, how do you do this work? And so it is a fairly significant shift from how research is typically done, right? That first tenet, that normativity, that idea that you're going to take a stand, right? You're not this neutral scholar doing the work, but that your purpose in the work is to fight for social justice, is to make whatever is going on better, right? So it certainly builds on critical theory in that way, that it is a normative approach. Where a key differentiator between CRT and CT is that centrality of white supremacy, right? That for CRT scholars, we're really interested in how the history of white supremacy has dominated our experiences within the marketplace. So in the paper, we use artificial intelligence integration into marketplace practices as a way of highlighting these tenets. And so we can see this kind of centrality of white supremacy when we think about AI and other types of technologies that are used in things like bathrooms, where you put your hand under the sink and it's supposed to be able to be a much more hygienic way of washing your hands. You're just going to put them underneath there, it's going to turn on. But we see time and time again, people with darker skin, they don't work, right? Facial recognition, similar issues, specifically when we think about intersectionality for Black women, where it has an easy time at recognizing white men, but a very difficult time recognizing Black women, right? So we can see that the centrality, the default, the centering of whiteness and white supremacy as a key aspect of the market, how the market logic works, right? And that's a key differentiator between CT and CRT. Challenging dominant ideologies. Here we're just, again, moving from this idea of objectivity and understanding that we as scholars are always situated within the research that we're doing. And so our positionalities matter. And we center the experiential knowledge of those that are actually being impacted by whatever we're studying, right? Where we're not studying on a person or on a community, we're studying with them, right? Because they are knowledge bearers in and of themselves, because they are experiencing it firsthand. And so those experiences are centered in that process, right? And we talked about this before, this idea to understand race, it's got to be taken on from an inter or transdisciplinary perspective. It's not just the one discipline that's going to allow us to understand the breadth of what's going on when we're thinking about race and markets. And then lastly, intersectionality is that last tenet, that it's not just about race in and of itself, but how it is interacting with other aspects of identity. Anything to add there, colleagues?
That's very good.
Great overview.
Okay. All right, so I'll turn it back over to, I think Guillaume's gonna go first, and this is more about our engaged scholarship and how we also see some theorizing around race in our engaged work.
It's just a question in terms of time, because I see the time is running. So maybe we won't play the video. Yeah. Because I'm quite concerned that, yeah. So I would just briefly go directly to just present what is the photo voice that we changed them to photo dialogue. What we tried to do during that workshop and after the paper that we generated. So the objective of that photo dialogue, that photo voice, was to explore race and market in using the photography method. So but as Kevin said, we got international scholars, but we did it in Paris, so we also got local activists, stake artists. We had different practitioners, different people coming in, and we were like about 20. And the idea was to get together in Paris, take picture, and try to exchange on what we see, how we experience Paris in relation to race and market. So I won't go through the entire time frame. If you go on the website, you can find the information. But for us, what was important there is really, as Kevin just said, is this notion of positionality. Try to position and to question the place within a space, which is not necessarily our space, and try to exchange with the people that are from this space. Try to always challenge the way we analyze, the way we see different things related to race and markets in a different context. Because in the group we have people from the UK, people from the US, and some people from other European countries in Paris. Where, as I said earlier, the discussion on race is always a bit complex. So it was interesting to have also Parisian and really to exchange about this. And from this exchange, from this dialogue, we really question this notion of visuality. So visuality is the fact of the site as a social fact, and try to question how we see and how the way we see influence what we see. Okay. And so we developed this notion of photo dialogue that was in opposition with the flaneur. So flaneur, I don't know if you heard of the flaneur, is type of archetype of the Parisian white man walking in the street of Paris and just like looking at things around, but to be very distant, this idea of being very distant, being kind of superior to what he's looking, but he's part of the crowd. What we developed with this notion of photo dialogue is to be part of the crowd, but to try to use it as an anti-racism proxy. So not to challenge this notion of the flaneur within the urban space in Paris, but this notion of how we can be in this urban space and try to understand it, but from more a personal point of view. Okay, so I won't go too much into that. I don't know if Kevin or Sonia, if you want to add on that, because I know we have other points to elaborate on. So, but there's a nice video. So if you want, you can go on the website, and there's a 10-minute video about what we did there during the photo voice workshop.
Okay. Should we move on?
And I'm just going to talk briefly about some engaged scholarship. I had some other slides, but I'm just going to use just this one and talk about a group that I've worked with called the Council on Black Health. It used to be called the African American Obesity Research Collaborative Network, which was a real mouthful. So the Council on Black Health is definitely an improvement from a mouthfeel perspective. The Council on Black Health believes in creating community engaged research, and that was a part of what I did. I served as the director of food marketing research for about 10 years, and now I'm still a faculty affiliate. The group wanted to make sure not to do what it has been called helicopter research, where researchers sort of drop into communities and drop back out and leave communities without any kind of sort of leave behind in terms of empowerment, understanding, education, skills that may come from the research or anything like that. So we had a $4 million grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and over several years created multiple community-based research projects that work directly with community partners. So we would have researchers in certain fields. So there's one paper where we did a sensitization process where we exposed people to how target marketing works, and then interviewed them about their responses around it, provided them a booklet to take home about more research around it, and then came back and interviewed them with this new understanding. And it was based on this notion of critical empowerment and engagement with communities in order to create research. We put the citation, I think, in the references if you're interested in that particular project, but happy to answer any questions about engaged scholarship on a scale that focuses on one particular problem. For 10, 12 years, we were focused solely on obesity, although we have expanded in the ways we focus and sort of narrowcast around food marketing and understanding targeted food marketing to Black consumers and how that related to their health and their ability to make the kind of choices they might want to make.
All right, and I will quickly as well talk about my engaged scholarship with Food for Black Thought, which was a kind of grassroots organization that my partner and I started in 2012. So my partner, Dr. Nair Jones, we were both at UT Austin at the time. Austin is known to be a foodie city. It's also known to be a very segregated city, much like many cities across the US and across the globe. And so we started the Food for Black Thought organization as a way to start talking about issues that were impacting specifically communities of color in Austin, where there were all this talk about bringing in community gardens. There was talk about food deserts on the east side, which is the east side of Austin is predominantly African-American and Latinx. And so the idea was that no one was really talking about this from a critical perspective. And so we thought we would leverage our kind of social capital, as at the time I was a newly minted assistant professor. She was a doctoral student. We would use our social capital to kind of start that conversation. And so the idea was to engage with community members, grassroots organizations, to get their sense of what needed to be done in their organization, in their communities, versus these kind of well-meaning white organizations and government entities that were saying, we need you to eat better, we need you to plant these community gardens, we're going to bring in a supermarket to this area. And so our idea was, well, how can we start to think about the historicalization of this process? How did we get to this point, right? No one really talked about, well, why is the city so segregated? Why are there no supermarkets on one side of the city? Why are certain supermarkets that are on that side seem to be dilapidated and rotten produce on the aisles and so forth? And so we worked with community, with folks on campus, as well as community, to kind of bridge the two. They really weren't talking to each other. And so we did have a 2-day symposium. One day was at campus, one day was at a community center in East Austin. And the idea was to have an open, action-based dialogue around what needs to be done, so that folks that were not being heard were not part of this conversation of how do we make Austin a much more equitable city around food and food landscapes could happen. And so that happened for 2 years. And then after that process, we applied for a curriculum grant through UT, and we got that grant. We were able to build some curriculum around this idea of exploring food and urban change and how it was impacting Austin specifically. And so we had about 30 students or so that went through this process. It was a year-long class. The first part of the class, the first semester, was just about learning the history of Austin. How did it become a divided city? How did the food landscape come to look at the way it did, and why was it so racialized? And then the second part of the course was the students actually developing PSAs to disseminate that knowledge, right? Because these were kind of hidden stories that weren't being told about how racism was really shaping the food landscape of the city. And so their job was to come up with some advertising messaging that would allow people to know more about that. And then lastly, from that process, we developed a paper that was published a couple of years ago that focused on our pedagogy that we use there around, specifically around critical reflexivity, which takes you to students from reflecting on aspects of their own identity and how they were being impacted by the food landscape, which is basically assessing, right? How did they actually, to reflect is to basically to assess some previous thing that you've done, and to move them from that point of assessment to move them to reflexivity, which is much more about growth and much more about transformation. How do I assess what I did, but also then integrate that into my behaviors and understanding of the world so that I do better from here on out. right? And so the paper really highlights that process of taking students from reflection to reflexivity around issues of race and the intersecting other aspects of their identity as they start to theorize around race and markets. So again, I know that's quick and dirty, but we want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So we're happy to go through questions at this point. I just wanted to quickly bring up that we do have some other aspects of our work that are forthcoming that we talked about. So the ISRF bulletin that Guillaume talked about on race and visual culture. There's a special issue on race and consumers in the Journal of Consumer Affairs that will be coming out very shortly. And then we're in the beginning stages of developing a piece for the International Journal of Advertising that will specifically focus on the role that advertising plays in our understanding of race and racism. All right, I think we're good for questions.
Okay, thank you. And you are not going to be disappointed if you are waiting for questions. So basically, I was trying to organize here all the questions that were coming, and I kind of noted it down. I did a thematic categorization of them. So let's start first with the big cheers from I mean, you are going to be able to see all the answers then, but to summarize, Isabella, Elise, Jade, Ana Raquel, which is supposed to be our host, and Miriam, they all said amazing presentation. They are thanking you a lot for sharing, especially your personal stances in relation to the theme. So everyone loved it, but these ones, they really came there. Oh, I really loved it. And it's okay. I'm going to start with the cheers. And then I tried to, a little bit of organize the comments. So I think Adriana Schneider, she asked about ethnicity and race, but I think that she did this before Guillaume presented the halal paper. So I kind of think that the question is answered. The relationship between ethnicity and race. However, if it's answered in the beginning, I think that there are lots of questionings about race and Brazil and race and the Global South. And so we have here Adriana Arcuri, Flavio, Francisco, and some of the colleagues that sent through Roberta a question. Precisely asking you, how do you think we can apply critical race theory in the Global South? And then I will add, I'm gonna use my moderator role here to put a few information that also drawing on our attendees. In Brazil, we have more than 50% of the population who's Black. However, and this is a very interesting phenomenon in this country, Blackness is very context dependent, right? So sometimes a person who in the US would be classified as Black, in Brazil is like, yeah, Black, not Black. This discussion it's very, very ingrained in the country. And another important thing is that the Brazilian elites, not only, I mean, once you kind of the elite, if you are half Black, half white, let's say like this, you kind of become white. So not only this process happens, but the Brazilian elites, they tend not to consider themselves real Brazilians, right? And there is a sociologist who says it, who theorizes this process quite well, which is José de Souza. And this reaction is ingrained historically in the racist process, historical process of the formation of Brazilian identity. So there's a lot of information here, but we want to hear from you. What do you think about doing critical race theory research or race-informed theorization in the Global South, especially in countries where you have this colonization processes and mimicry processes that are deeply ingrained in their identities?
I can just start with a big picture piece, is that there are other places where you have seen some of that going on. I know work in South Africa is a place that, because of the diversity of the population and the different dynamics around race, that race is very context bound there, and some scholars are working on those issues. So that may be one place to look in terms of what they're doing as well. You know, for example, when I'm there, until I speak, people think of me as a certain race, which may vary depending even which city I'm in, whether I'm in Cape Town or whether I'm in Johannesburg. And I become part of a different group, and the responses to me are different. I did my dissertation work there, and so that's something that I've thought a lot about and tried to bring sort of that openness and fluid, different way of thinking about race to the way we think about race in the US. But I think, like any location or context, that it has to be driven by the specific social historical aspects and features that are most relevant. And going to your second question, and I'm going to let Guillaume and Kevin jump in, but I think the CRT paper does lay out in the general discussion a very clear template of this is how you might approach applying this to issues that are of relevance to you. And I think taking the understanding of the tenets and thinking how they relate to the types of evidence you see around race in the Brazilian society is an approach that I think would guide you towards that way. I don't know what Kevin or Guillaume.
No, I would just build on that and say, yeah, we need folks in other contexts to help us flesh out this more, right? Because most of the CRT work is done in the US context. But I do think the tenets are flexible enough where you can, put them in different contexts and see how they need to be shifted so that it makes more sense within that context. But we need folks that have that intimate knowledge of the historical context to do that work, right? I don't have that. I mean, I've been to Rio once and I loved it, but I don't have the history to know, right, how I need to shift my understanding of the centrality of white supremacy in the Brazilian context, right? Even though we know from a colonial perspective, it's there. But how does it actually express itself and operate and shift based on context? That requires that local experiential knowledge to develop it, right? And so we need folks to hopefully give us a sense of, well, how can this CRT be used and thought of as much more reportable theory versus it being very specific to a very kind of US-centric expression.
I have nothing to add. I totally agree with that. I think it's important on context and should not take CRT as when I talk about religion, that's something you cannot move. It's not the Bible or some book like that. It's something which is flexible. You can build on it depending on the context, or you can also build your own theory. I think this should not come. I think it should not be seen as a up-down approach. I think scholars should be able. Brazilian scholars should be able to do that work the way they want to do it.
Thank you, Guillaume. I think we struggle quite a lot with that in Brazilian academia, which is like, should we tend to use this toolbox that comes from abroad and apply to our reality. And sometimes it does work. Sometimes, there are contextual and colonization differences that, we have to adapt. I have a question here that was made by Denise that I'm going to read out loud because it's very powerful what she wrote. But I think at some point it's a little bit what Leticia and Ana Raquel and Talita also were asking. So it's one question that summarizes four, and I'm going to read out loud. So Denise, she wrote, I recently attended a session at an international conference where a respected scholar said that racism is sufficiently treated in academia because at least once a year, journals publish papers on the topic. When making a systematic review of the literature nationally and internationally, it is easy to observe that it's not true and that there is the same space that works for works that expose structural racism and or that non-white academics have the same space as their white colleagues. So basically, we know that we do not, that you guys, that Black scholars and racialized and people of color in general do not have the same space. So in your opinion and experiences, why is there so much difficulty in understanding that structural racism permeates social relations and, of course, market relations, and as such, is a topic that should not be addressed as specific to a group or a special circumstance? I really like this question.
That's I'll jump in and start, right? I don't mind looking crazy. I believe that one key reason is that it means that people have to change. It means that the status quo is no longer acceptable, and people are uncomfortable with change. In the American context, we tend to think about individual agency and individual responsibility as underlying everything. And so when we start to talk about structural issues like structural racism, we're saying that here's some systematic factor that has patterned the experiences of people outside of their individual agency. And people are not just as comfortable with that and saying that, you know, we know, for example, that housing, what's the word? Segregation, housing segregation is, has been driven by US government policies for years. That's a clear example of structural racism. But if you say that to people who have maybe benefited from that, they don't want to hear about it. And I think those are big issues. Just the discussion piece is really important, and the discussion piece is really rare. And so being able, as academics, you would imagine we could talk about anything. But one of the things we said in the Icon paper is that all of us have been at conferences when you talk about race and the room goes quiet. Or when I was doing work on obesity, I would talk about, you know, the race and obesity, and people would say, but income, blah, blah, blah. And I would have shown, you know, 50 slides about race. And so the discomfort of talking about race means that we don't get to the nuances and the ability to integrate the things that we know around that more generally. But I think that's sort of the big picture answer to that question. I don't know if either of you want to add.
What I would add to that is, and it's just building on it, is that sense of, we spend, even the work that we do on race is really focused on the oppression side of things, right? And so their idea is that, well, the system's fine, we just got to get rid of this oppression stuff and then we'll be okay. And versus saying that, no, the system has oppression and privilege built into it. And and both have to be addressed. And to Sonia's point, people are fine to an extent trying to find some interventions for the oppression aspect of things, but they don't necessarily want to deal with the idea of having to give up their privilege, or having power dynamics shift, where they're having now to share power that they didn't have to share before, right? And so when we think about academia, which was not built for people of color, right? It was built on the idea of white scholars going out and finding new knowledge on things, and right. And so we're already having to fit ourselves into a system that was not built for us. And so it needs to shift, but because it was built a certain way and it benefits certain people a certain way, it's going to be very difficult to shift that unless we can start to really talk about both the oppression and the privilege aspects that need to be dealt with. If we're solely focused on oppression, then privilege gets normalized, and that becomes standardized. And that has to shift. You know, it is to a certain extent a zero-sum game. And as an example, I'm on a task force at my university where we're trying to get more engaged scholarship to be counted towards tenure. Because right now it's just not counted. It's put at the bottom of your service. But the idea is that some of these scholars, that's all they do. They do engaged scholarship, and it may not always end up with an article in an A journal or an article at all. Right, but it's transformational. It has a true impact on academia and beyond, and so it needs to be shifted so that it can count. And we've been doing this I've been there for over almost 3 years now, and it's been hitting our heads against this brick wall that people don't want to change this system because it does benefit certain people, and those people don't look like me and don't do my type of work, right? And so there is that sense of having to have that difficult conversation of, well, how did it come to be this way? And are there blind spots that we're not addressing? And those blind spots have to be addressed for us to actually have a fullness of what it means to be a person of color doing this work.
I agree. I don't have anything to add on what has been said. I think there's this notion of political priorities. I see that in the French context. I think it's just like some people assume there's political priorities. As Sonia said, some people will be like income. Some people will say environment, global warming. I think some people have got different political priorities, and they will try to silence other issues, because they consider this is not a problem. This is not a problem. Why this is not a problem? Because they may be benefiting from it. So I think we need to see those type of discourse, that this as a political discourse, not as an academic discourse. And we have to we cannot just the person just said in the question, since this is not the truth. This person was just, there's one paper a year and this is good. This is not enough. But this is just a political discourse. And on the other hand, we need to take care of ourselves. We hear that, and we should not be always like, oh, you need to know that this is done on purpose. This is done on purpose to hurt. So we need to, this is one thing. This is the reason why we created REAM too, because it was we used to deal with this type of issue individually. From the moment we came together, we could say, okay, let them talk, but we have a group together, we have the power, and we're moving things towards a goal, and we're trying to do it.
Yeah,
I would add to that too, just jumping on Kevin's point about your task force and people doing engaged work, is that like, I was never a big user of LinkedIn, and now I look at LinkedIn, and every institution and university and corp company and organization is spotlighting people who are doing engaged work in these same issues. I've never seen so much color on the LinkedIn timeline in my life. Every organization is, putting pictures of everyone, for this reason. So I think it will be really interesting to see what happens in the future if this actually changes things from a perspective of considering, now that institutions are having to look at this because it's being demanded by external audiences in a way that makes them to go and find it and highlight things that they have not incentivized or supported in prior years.
Thank you for your answers. And I really think this is also the space, go activist. You are activists beyond being academics. I think this was clear in the presentation. I think this is one of the reasons why everyone loved it. It's because it was so transparent. And I agree, it's a political matter, but as consumer research scholars, or let's say cultural consumption scholars, I think that we should not escape politics, right? At least though, I really think we should face it. I think that there was one person that sort of mentioned this topic. I don't know, he didn't, Francisco, he didn't develop so much, ask for clarification, but he didn't answer. But one of the things that I also, from myself, I would say is that when you think about research in ethnicity, not so much right now, right? Especially not so much after 2015, when research in ethnicity in consumer research and TCR started going a little bit beyond and being very interested in well-being. We can say that a part of research in ethnicity that is not so culturally focused has, in some ways, otherized the ethnical subject. And thinking about Black scholars, one that I like very much is Bell Hooks and her essay on eating the other. And as a Brazilian myself, I sometimes see that to get published, sometimes we have to do an effort to exoticize ourselves and say, hey, this is interesting. So this is one of the things that I would like to ask you, and this is not from the audience, it's from myself. Have you faced this need to authorize maybe your own experiences to be the author to be eaten for reviewers that claim for more sort of authenticity? If this is one question. And the second question is, once I was in a CCT roundtable that I think was from Latin American scholars, I think it was in Finland. And one of the things that people were asking in that roundtable were discussing is that CCT is actually the exercise of looking the familiar with the zodiac eyes, which is more or less the opposite what classic anthropology used to do, right? And so if my other second question, which follows the authorization one, is if at some point we are as, people of color or people from colonized countries, more or less pushed to authorize ourselves, why don't we start looking at whiteness with exoticizing gaze? So I don't know if you want to answer, if you want to say anything about it.
No, I ask that same question all the time. And with my own work, it doesn't happen as much anymore, but when I first started my work, it was a lot of times I would get asked, well, because I would really focus in on either the Black experience or I've done work looking at transracial consumers. What they want me to compare it to the norm, which is, well, can we talk about the mainstream, right? And basically white people, right? And it's not enough that I have this rich data that talks about this very interesting topic that hasn't been discussed and how they're having either issues in the marketplace or have found this interesting navigations of the marketplace. That's not enough. It always has to be in comparison to this imagined norm, which is whiteness. And so that's been very frustrating. And the other aspect is I feel like people they're used to seeing stories that talk about again, going back to the oppression, the suffering of people of color. But when you just want to talk about the humanity of people of color or the joy or just the mundaneness of living in a body that has to navigate racism on a daily basis, there's always a question of, well, where's what's new about this or what's interesting here, or there's this pushback of well, that's not what I was expecting from this. Where's the pain? Where's the suffering? That's what I'm used to seeing. So I get that a lot, and so yeah, I do wonder why we don't trouble this idea of even when we're talking about ethnicity. White people have ethnicity. How come we're not talking about their ethnicities? When we talk about ethnic studies or ethnic food or ethnic whatever, it's generally just a stand-in for not white. When in actuality, they too have some very interesting nuances that could be brought out if we did talk about disturb that sense of whiteness and talk about what does it mean to go from being Italian to being white, or to go from being Irish to being white, right? So we see this in other fields, but we don't really do that in marketing.
Sonia and Guillaume, do you want to say something?
I don't think so, but I will, I was trying to think about your exoticized aspect of it, and I've seen it happen in much more national and cultural contexts. So for example, I had a paper about Cuba, and the reviews were very much a sense of, why does this sound like so much the same? Why does this sound like what we do? Why does this sound like the way we approach social marketing, as opposed to something that must be going on very different there, because there's a social and, everything different context. There were a couple of places where we got really strange reviews on that paper and ended up just taking it someplace else for that reason, because we felt it was sort of this desire to kind of, I don't know if it's eat the other, but exoticize the content of what we were doing to make it appear more different. And I think that kind of relates to Kevin's, like there's this internal norm, even when there's not an external norm of what we are being evaluated or how research is evaluated or assessed in terms of what the content is when it's particularly about race or culture or some of these those types of constructs.
It's well, so I think that then we have a set of questions here that are kind of personal, but I think that you touched upon some of the things already. But it's, how do you endure all this, be explaining all the time that race is important, that structural racism exists, you have to be educating people all the time about the same subject over and over. So I understand that that requires some sort of patience. Actually, I was having this experience not very long ago about, discussing amongst other scholars from marketing and other areas, and they were trying to think like, hey, we should try to get this research subject about things that we want, some sort of ethics research group. And at some point I said, yeah, we should think about intersectionality. And many people didn't know what it is. And we're talking that something happened 2 months ago, right? And it's a concept from the 90s and everyone's talking about it. So how do you endure this teacher role all the time? And also many questions on how do you manage to, even doing all that and the activism, to be so productive? So this is for the trio of you.
Well, I guess I can start by just going back to Guillaume's point that that's partly one of the key ways why we wanted to build RIM. Like we too are tired of having to constantly have these same conversations of why this is important and how do you do it and so forth. And so the idea behind RIM was, how do we build a legitimate space where this work can be done without it being questioned, right? Without having to answer those questions again and again, and to provide people that are doing this work with legitimate spaces to distribute their work. So that's why we want to do special issues of journals, and we did the RIM book. The idea is that we want to truly build a network, right? That it is allows people to not have to go into certain spaces that may not be as welcoming, right? We want to have a space where their work can be celebrated for the worth that it brings to academia.
But the only thing I would add is that it makes it hard to go to other conferences now. I really don't want to go to other conferences for the reason that you suggest. I mean, we go to conferences to get intellectually stimulated. And if you go to a conference and there's not things that really relate to what you're interested in, or that you feel don't relate to your life or your experiences, that's not fulfilling. Especially if you have nothing else and it's the way you have to move forward in your field, that's one thing. But then you have an alternative where you can go and everybody has the basic understanding of what race is, and that you can then learn and grow yourself. And I think that's, a big part of RIM is helping people to grow, as opposed to just being focused on that educational piece that they might be doing individually, where they might be the only scholar studying these issues, but providing that space where people can come together and say, let me learn something new from a different discipline, a different field that takes me beyond where I already am. And that to me is very sustaining. That, helps to keep doing it in the face of those other times when you might have to do some education. And in my case, at some point I've said, I'm not going to do that education anymore. I'm going to focus on really supporting and helping to grow, what we are doing here, because that's where my heart is. And that's what other people do, is focus on their research. And I think that becomes, a way to support and reinforce the, non-neutrality of the market, as Kevin discussed.
And the other question about how do we do so much, I would just say, I just ride on the coattails of Sonia and Guillaume. I'm along for the ride.
Are we producing much? Are we? I don't know. I've got the feeling that we always need to do more. I don't know.
I think it's passion. And I think it's because we work well together. We've been doing this for a while, and we do think about other aspects. It's not just about work. We care about each other. We think about the other pieces of, at our conferences, we had meditation, we had yoga, we had, other ways of being that recognize the humanity of people. And that's a different way of just researching. I mean, I've had experiences where you only talk about research with people. You might talk about the occasional movie when you go to dinner at conferences or things like that, but you don't really get into the nuanced understanding of who people are. And I believe that that has helped all of us in some way by having an organization that provides a space where it's more than a conference and it's more than work. Because race is more than work for a lot of people who do work on race and people who are racialized. Race is real life. It's not just a research topic.
So, well, we still have 12 minutes. I'm going to end the whole talk basically with letting you talk about your research activities, because everyone is crazy to get to know more about the photo project and about the special issues and everything. So, but before, I'll let you repeat this very useful information. Then there's also a question by myself. I really would like you guys to, if you could, give a few books, not necessarily academic, but a few books that marked your intellectual formation or that really inspired your books or movies. So we can start a little reading list on how to to engage ourselves, not necessarily only academically, but also personally with the issue that is being discussed right now.
Books, maybe I will say books. I like James Baldwin because he's American, but he was also writing about France. I like Giovanni's Rooms. Probably the only book he doesn't really talk explicitly about race, but I found this book inspiring. And he has so many other books that also talk about racial issues in France, in the US. Yeah, so this is something that really inspires me. And the writing style too, the way he writes. And it's really, I guess it's something which is important in the research, is to look to find people that write nicely and to find inspiration. And I love reading the New Yorker too. I find like some brilliant pieces in the New Yorker, long pieces, because now I don't have the patience to read books. So I get to those long articles in the New Yorker, and I found there's some brilliant books, the brilliant articles that talk about other things. Sometimes I'm just race tired, so I don't try to not read things about race. So I read about global warming, I read about class, about gender. I say, oh, it's not about race, I read it. And this helps me to get some inspiration for my research.
I really just like that you said, oh yeah, I'm not always reading about race. Sometimes I'm reading about other types of catastrophes and oppressions, like climate change or gender, right? So, and sometimes looking at COVID evolution graphics, right? Thanks for your answer.
I didn't know that Guillaume loved James Baldwin is my favorite author. And I, find his writing on race even though it's, a lot of it's old, it's very new and it's very relevant about today in very story approaches. And I find that the stories really help to bring it to life and to be able to think about how it applies across different areas. A book that I read a long time ago, I just turned around and looked, was Medical Apartheid, which was very influential to me. I read it before I went into the public health field, but giving me an understanding that I knew what was coming with COVID, just from having read this book and studying health disparities, that it had given me a sense of what to expect and what was there and how people would respond to it. And I think, not knowing that the racial reckoning would come at the same time, but that was very influential in terms of what I was doing. The Algorithms of Oppression book is also very influential in terms of helping to understand how these algorithms can lead to the types of disparities that we have noted and how the whole process within them. And those would be two that really kind of stand out for me. And I also, Ashante Reese's book on Black food geographies is a very important book that helps to think about food. It's set in Washington, D.C., so it's my hometown, and to think about food from beyond just the oppressive nature of the disparities that we see, and to be able to think about Black joy and everything around it as well. Kevin?
Yeah, those are all on my list as well. I would add to that the book Silencing the Past by Michel Trousseau. It totally blew my mind, just how the historicizing of the revolution in Haiti as a case study of just how history is constructed and reconstructed, and who gets to tell that history. So it really does put power dynamics in the forefront and troubles our understanding of how we understand our own histories. So that was really transformational for me. Toni Morrison, Toni Morrison, particularly Plain in the Dark, which is just this really tiny, sweet little book where she does this amazing deconstruction of popular media and like old movies and just how whiteness is again central to the storytelling process of most of our popular culture. And then recently I saw a fascinating documentary, Exterminate All the Brutes. I think it's like a four part. It's hard to watch. It is very gritty and graphic, but it is so comprehensive when it tells the story of the legacy of colonialism, and it does it from a global perspective, which is really nice. So I think it's a book as well, and it pulls from Silencing the Past as well, and so that's also amazing. And to Galen's point, I don't get to read as much anymore, but I do like to watch these little, I'm a YouTube freak, so I'm always on YouTube, and they have these little maybe 5 to 10 minute videos from Vox or Vice News that will, in 10 minutes give you a really in-depth discussion of, like right now I'm learning more about the issues around Palestine and Israel. Like I had no idea some of that history, right? It was never taught to me at school, even in graduate school. And so in 10 minutes, I learned way more than I had been taught in 20 years of education, right? And so I think some of these kind of small independent journalistic outputs really do produce some amazing stuff that really get me thinking about, I can see some connections between how things are going in Palestine and how things are going on the east side of Austin, right? There's similar issues at play and making those connections.
Yeah, and I can't forget this one, to make sure that we say Consumer Equality and Race in the Marketplace, which is by Geraldine Henderson, Anne-Marie Hexton, and Jerome Williams. And this will be our tribute conference will be to the evolution of the research and the research frameworks that they started. So I didn't want to forget that one.
And Race in the Marketplace, it's free download.
Thank you so much. This is really inspiring. I have a list of things to read, and it just gets bigger and bigger, right? The list of things that I'm going to buy and put on my holiday reading. So we have, I think, 2 or 3 minutes to finish. So I'm just gonna let you talk a little bit about the special issues and a little bit on how people can find more information about what you guys are doing. And then I'm going to just say goodbye to everyone after this. So you can just give a few more information.
So the Journal of Marketing Management special issue is out now, right? And so the first article, the intro article is open access. So you're more than welcome to go to J&M's website and download that. I think there's about 10 or 11 other pieces that are there. It's multimodal, so there's poetry, there's traditional research work, there's wonderful paper on Brazilian women and hair care in there. And so certainly check that out if you can. And this Consumer Affairs, is that one coming out next couple of months?
Within the next month.
Yeah. Okay.
And we also have our website. I opened our website so that you can see it. You can download the book on the website. We have a repository of articles about marketing and advertising articles related to race. We have information on the special issues with the new special issue forthcoming. Someone asked about the photo voice. So some of those arts-based projects are listed under there, as well as the White Rain Dysfunction that we did and the movie that we did for ACR. We have blogs that relate to some of the articles that we've had in the special issues, as well as other works that we highlight on the website as well.
Well, so I think that in 2 minutes, Marlon will start his open session. So I really would like to thank you all. Hope to that we can stay in touch. Thank you so much. I learned a lot today. I think it's the same for the audience. Sorry if I said anything that was kind of in bêtise, as we say in French, because sometimes, I kind of get nervous of talking, with the senior scholars live for a bunch of people. I don't even know how many people that are watching us. We're gonna know soon. So thank you so much. Sorry for anything. Como dizemos em português, muito obrigada, desculpa qualquer coisa. This is a typical Brazilian expression, sorry for anything. Desculpa qualquer coisa. Obrigada pela audiência, obrigada pelas questões, vocês foram ótimos. Fiquem com Marlon, thank you so much. And hope to see you soon in some conference in real life.
Bye, thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.